So, this evening, we're going to talk about the concept of brainwashing, and we're going to use examples from film to give us a lens as to what brainwashing is and what brainwashing isn't, and how it's depicted in our pop culture, and what we can learn from it. And it's going to be generally through the lens of the cult, or technically the correct term is a new religious movement, but cult is just easier to say. And also, when I think about brainwashing and stuff, it isn't just about cults as well. You see it in political movements, you see it in political opinions that people go on and on and on about repeatedly as we go on. And these particularly come up over and over again. You see them on Twitter and stuff. Someone goes a bit wrong and suddenly starts banging on and on and on about how much they hate trans people or something like that. People get radicalized. And this is all part of the same phenomenon, the same psychological phenomenon. And I'm hoping to get that across this evening. But before we start properly, I want you to watch a couple of minutes of a video. This is an extract from a video called The Authentic Human, which appeared on YouTube about 3 years ago.
So what does it mean to be authentic? When someone's authentic, you feel them. You have this feeling of a soul there.
Right.
Not a robot, not some pre-programmed, contrived face or something along those lines. It just seems to come naturally from their experience of existing on this planet. From the time they are conceived and they become a child and grow and all of this thing, they gather this unique impression of existence. And authenticity somehow is a manifestation of all of that. And it also relates to wisdom. I always say wisdom is taking your life experience and being able to apply it in a decision. It's a global way of acting as opposed to a narrow way where, oh, I feel like doing this. I'm not thinking of anything that ever happened to me. No lessons have ever been learned, and I'm just going to go and do this thing. Likewise, authenticity has no additional layers of artifice, no trying to be something that you think you should be. It's just a pure state of being. So one would say authenticity is being as you are and expressing as you are, at least to some degree. And as you are is, of course, the sum of your whole past. So when someone's being authentic, you get the feeling that not only that there's a person there in the moment, but somehow you reach into their very essence and you meet a unique individual.
I don't know why, that makes me want to cry. It's beautiful.
Yeah, apparently that's beautiful. Aside from, there's a lot wrong with that. I mean, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot wrong there. He's actually not really saying anything particularly revolutionary or interesting at all. He's basically saying that people get to be real people by being people, is pretty much how it boils down. But apart from, obviously, the fact that they're either in a set badly designed to look like a house, or in a house that looks like a set badly designed to look like a house, which is possibly even worse. The simple thing that I want to get across is that the interviewer there who is talking to this gentleman is Alison Mack. And Alison Mack is best known for having played Chloe on Smallville for about 10 years. And the man she's talking to is Keith Raniere, who's apparently 56 years old when this video was made, which is quite impressive. And yeah, so I think the point I want to bring across really is that all of this sounds lovely and interesting and intriguing if you don't think too much about it, because essentially people get to be people by being people isn't really something that you should be giving this man money for. But then this happens.
So what is it?
No, not that happened. This happens. It turns out that Keith Ranier's group, which is called NXIVM, was a multi-level marketing scheme that became a cult, and specifically a sex slave cult. And Alison Mack, as his second in command, or his third in command possibly, took the fall in court and claimed responsibility for shocking stories of sex trafficking and abuse. Women were getting branded on their private parts with his initials. They were being denied food and drink. They were being shut away from their families, and being treated like literal slaves, to the extent that both Raniere and Mack are now on their way to prison for human trafficking. If you think about Raniere, what Raniere was talking about, there's about 15 minutes of that video actually, and it doesn't really go anywhere interesting. Trust me, I've watched the whole thing through twice. But one thing is that it never once talks about the authentic human talking with other authentic humans. There's nothing about relationship in there, and in fact Raniere is a big fan of Ayn Rand and believes that people would live more ethically and authentically if they just do whatever the hell they want and exist with enlightened self-interest and ignore parasites. And he defines parasites as people who need your help. Why am I bringing this up? Because essentially the first point is, at some point Alison Mack was recruited by this guy and was brought high up in the ranks of the cult. The second point is that many of the women involved in the cult stayed in the cult. In fact, a big plank of the defense in the trial was that they were adults who'd made adult decisions and that they had done this consensually. And when it comes to what we think of as brainwashing, consent becomes a very slippery thing. That's just by way of prologue. Let's talk a bit about what brainwashing is. Now, in cinema and TV, specifically, to be fair, genre cinema and TV, especially in science fiction and fantasy, somewhat less in horror, but mainly also in spy stuff, brainwashing is sort of presented as kind of hypnosis. It's presented as people being put into a trance by some sort of like abusive or coercive or possibly even surgical method. For example, in Jordan Peele's amazing film Get Out, which I've waxed lyrical about last week, we have someone hypnotized. And actually, in Get Out, the hypnosis isn't actually that badly presented, because one of the things about hypnosis is that it's temporary. And so in Get Out, you've got the bit where Catherine Keener taps a teacup with a spoon and suddenly he's unable to move because of a post-hypnotic suggestion. And even so, when he wakes up, he's tied up because it's temporary until the next time that the hypnosis happens. And the thing about hypnosis is, well, one, you never know if you're susceptible or not. I discovered I was susceptible to it a while back, which, you think your mind's a fortress, and the next thing you know, someone claps their hands and you're quacking like a duck or something. And the second thing is that it's not sort of like a zombie thing. You enter a kind of state where you're either drunk, it's like being drunk or high, and that your brain is actually saying, like, I could totally stop pretending to be Sharon Needles at any moment, but I'm not going to. And that's a really dangerous place to be in. And there's a truism that hypnotism can't make you do things against your nature, but that's actually not true. It kind of can. And you might wake up in the morning not remembering what happened or feeling really weird about it, but you will wake up. It is temporary. It's not permanent. You don't have people wandering around like sort of hypnotic zombies for the whole time. It's you know, there's entire categories of science fiction and fantasy, and even I've discovered while looking this up, erotica, about people who are living in a permanent state of hypnosis. And you have things like, for example, the 1966 spy movie with James Coburn called Our Man Flint, which has a subplot where the bad guys basically have an entire bevy of hypnotized babes who they call pleasure units, who are basically just there in the spa they've got in the corner of their evil compound. And yeah, that's a film that could only be PG in 1966, frankly. It's problematic, to use a word popular with the internet kids. And actually, before I go on, actually, what I should say is that, just as a warning, there will be talk about things like violated consent and suicide and stuff like that as we go on, because we're talking about cults and brainwashing and stuff. But fair warning, okay? We're going to get into some dark places as we go on. Anyway, having talked about what brainwashing isn't, it's probably time to talk about what it is. Now, brainwashing as a term was first coined by a writer called Edward Hunter in 1950. And Edward Hunter was not a psychologist. Edward Hunter was a propagandist, a Red Scare propagandist and journalist, right-wing journalist, who wrote this book called Brainwashing. And it's about soldiers who get caught by the Chinese and why they seem to defect. And he was under the opinion that they had had terrible things done to them to change their personalities. The term brainwashing is actually a slight mistranslation of a Chinese term, which was used to describe getting your thoughts in order before you do something ritual or spiritual. But you know, he's mistranslated this phrase, he runs with it, and the rest is, as they say, fake news. How much in his book Brainwashing is actually true, I don't know. Probably not as much, but it's interesting that around this time the CIA was actually attempting to do stuff like this using drugs and electric shocks and torture, and accidentally killing and permanently damaging people because oops. And I get the distinct impression that people just assume that everybody else operates on the same ethical level they do. So whether or not the Chinese were actually doing it, they thought that the Chinese were doing it because they were trying to. This is useful as a context because the original conception of brainwashing doesn't, we're going to come back to it in a bit, but actually the way that brainwashing actually happens in ideological groups, and we're using religions mainly as our testing, is a very different thing. Now, one example of the way in which people get brainwashed by cults appears in a movie from a few years ago, which has one of possibly either the greatest titles in the history of cinema or the worst. The movie is called 7 Stages to Achieve Eternal Bliss by Passing Through the Gateway Chosen by the Holy Storch. In this movie, you have Claire and Paul, who are the shocked-looking individuals in the picture here. And Claire is played by Linda Micucci, who is most known now actually as the current voice of Velma on various series of Scooby-Doo cartoons. But in this, she plays Claire, and she works in advertising, and she's moved to Los Angeles with her useless boyfriend Paul, and they have rented a flat and an apartment. Sorry, I'm talking to Americans. They've rented this apartment, and the landlord has not told them, being a landlord, that it used to belong to a cult leader called Reginald Storch, and Storch, played in Flashback and also in Mystic Visions by Taika Waititi, is someone who decided to achieve eternal bliss by committing suicide in their bathtub. And the bathtub that they've just rented. And every couple of nights now, a member of the cult breaks into the flat and commits suicide in the bathtub. And so they're stuck with this flat, and they can't leave the flat because they've got a job, and well, Claire's got a job, and it's convenient for the freeway, which is a constant thing that they say about it. And they just have to deal with these religious fanatics committing suicide in the bathtub on a regular basis. As it goes on, we discover a number of things. One of the cult members quite early on leaves a copy of Storch's book, and they pick up the book and they read it, and they go, well, actually, this is quite reasonable. Liberate yourselves from the shackles of overthought. And so on. The 7 stages. Liberate yourselves from the shackles of overthought is stage 1. Claire starts using the principles in the terms of her advertising work. Excuse me. And so on. But we discover also that as we go on, that Claire and Paul have trauma in the past. They've moved here from Ohio, where Paul accidentally caused a zombie apocalypse due to failing to get the laundry done on time, which is a bonkers move in terms of the film. But there we go. Anyway, this means that they're sort of not in a good place. They're both traumatized. They have a whole bunch of stuff going on. So they seize upon the book. They decide, actually, the Storch is kind of got a lot going for him, and actually he may be right. And then he appears in a vision to Claire. And then they start deciding that really a lot of these cult members are committing suicide in awfully painful and inefficient ways, and they can actually help them with that. And it goes on, and eventually by the end of the film, they are absolutely, completely 100% sold on the doctrine of Storch, and that goes exactly where you might think it does. And it's a comedy. It's a very dark comedy, but it's a sort of, I mean, it falls in the category of quirky indie comedy. You can see that from the title. It's the sort of film that has Flaming Lips on the soundtrack. So, you know, make of it what you will. I actually don't think I laughed a lot in this film. I'll be honest, mostly in the first hour. It loses the plot towards the end. But anyway, it's quite a good film because it's quite a good film in terms of presenting the idea of how extreme religious belief changes you, because it accurately represents what psychiatrists and psychologists describe as the 4 stages of a religious conversion, or indeed any ideological conversion. Right. So these are the stages that you go through if you convert ideologically, if you have a sort of like life-changing experience that changes the way you see things. So first, you have dissatisfaction with your life. There's something kind of wrong. There's something you're looking for. There's something not quite right, not quite working for you. Okay. After that, you reach a point where it just gets really terrible. You have the dark night of the soul. They call it the incubation period, where you're just shut down. You just despair. You're like, shit, what do I do now? No idea what's going to happen next. What happens? It's at this precise moment, and this is the really, really important bit, because you have to be at this point And then you have to meet exactly the right circumstances to have your enlightenment. That moment where you see it all now, you know, the Pope says, I don't know, the universe is made of Lego, and you're like, whoa! And that sort of thing is unique for all of us. I mean, it's not wholly unique. I mean, okay, why do people take John 3:16 signs to sporting events? And they particularly do that in the US, but they do it here too. Why do they do that? And why is it so frustrating for them that most people just go, oh, a John 3:16 sign? And a lot of people don't even know that John 3:16 is, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whoever believeth in him shall not perish but have eternal life. You can see I spent a lot of time in churches. But it's because it's the gotcha that worked for them. It worked for them. It's the magic phrase, but it worked for them. The thing is, most people, they think it's a magic phrase, but they missed the bit that it's a magic phrase because it hit them at the precise moment when they needed to hear it. I mean, it's like new atheists coming up with that bullshit Douglas Adams line about looking for fairies at the bottom of the garden as if it's some kind of gotcha. And it's the same sort of thing. You sort of like, you see people, however they do it, come up with these lines which they sort of like go, ha, gotcha, you can't defeat this. And then act kind of surprised or shocked or just sort of confused when you're just like, and? Anyway, after you've had this enlightenment experience, after it's set off the bomb that's already been set in your soul, then comes the reordering and consolidation phase, the this changed my life, can I give you this leaflet phase, where you have been transformed, you are changed. And this is where what we think of as brainwashing happens. Now, this is quite personal for me because, and I've got to be honest, if I wrote my life as a novel, a lot of people would just go, there's no way this makes sense. But I have actually spent some time in a cult in the past, which is something that I've spent the last 23 years processing and writing about and thinking about and working on in various different quarters and approaching. And I spent a year being the most insufferable evangelical fundamentalist you could possibly imagine. And then I spent several years pretending to be the most insufferable evangelical fundamentalist you could possibly imagine. And that's because I was surrounded by a whole bunch of other people who either were insufferable evangelical fundamentalists or who were also pretending to be insufferable evangelical fundamentalists and not telling anybody, just like I wasn't. And so we were all sort of confirming and consolidating each other because community is important. So let's look at some TV and films that present this. So in 2016, Sonia O'Hara pretty much self-funded and produced a two-part serial called Doomsday, which wound up on Amazon Prime. It's on Amazon Prime, included with Prime in the UK. I don't know if it's in the US, but I think it is. But it only went to 2 episodes. It never got finished. That's not a problem because the 2 episodes that exist are actually a very accurate representation of how it's possible to control people even when they're not necessarily on the same page as you all the time. So in Doomsday, you have a new agey sort of vegan cult led by Dagny, Karen Agstam, who is the late woman in the middle there. And, the people have to wear burlap sacks and they eat vegan and they're constantly fed various weird brews full of herbs and magic mushrooms and things like that. So they spend a lot of time high and they recruit as well. And Dagny spends the entire 2 episodes constantly moving the goalposts, abusing and gaslighting her followers, telling them stuff that's complete fabrications, inflicting rules upon them that she completely ignores. She and actually involving herself in physical discipline of people who go off the track, off message. And what's interesting is that while not everybody in the cult is always on her side, they're still there and they've become dependent upon her. So you have these moments where they're almost like kids. They need her to be mum. They call her gentle mother. And when she disciplines them, she has the kind of viewpoint of the abusive parent, the whole "this is going to hurt me more than it hurts you" bullshit that causes untold harm to untold families in the Western world for untold centuries. But there's a scene in the 2nd episode where she essentially cancels the all-night naked in the dark midsummer ritual, and they all start whining like kids. They're like, "Oh, I was really looking forward to the midsummer ritual. Please, can we have the midsummer ritual?" And you just think, yeah, they've been infantilized. They've been reduced, even though there's one member of the group who's actually planning on murdering her, but they're still behaving like kids around her. They're still behaving like they can't manage. Another example of the way in which you see people forced into dependency by cult leader is, and to be fair, a little bit more, much more flawed, massively flawed, but still worth a look, is in the 7th season of American Horror Story, the cult season. Now, one of the things that I both love and find hugely frustrating about American Horror Story is that you are always, in any given season, looking for that moment where it just goes right off the rails. An American Horror Story cult is no excuse. It goes right off the rails towards the end. There's a point around episode 7 or episode 8 where you just think, no, Ryan Murphy, no. But even so, you see this character, Kai Anderson, played by American Horror Story regular Evan Peters, who starts out as a sort of internet shitposter. He becomes a sort of alt-right demagogue, but he develops this cult. And he develops this cult with this magnetic control over people, including his sister there, who's played by Billie Lourd, by getting people to tell him the truth. And when he gets people to tell him the truth, he recruits them because he's able to work on their truth and use them and manipulate them that way. And there's that weird sort of crossover between sincerity and manipulation that is actually really important when we look at new religions, at cults, as it were, because you have a difference between the leaders and the members, a hierarchical thing. The leaders are privileged to more information, and the leaders are privileged often to lie. And in fact, finding out those lies is probably the greatest and most obvious way to escape a cult. In fact, one of the things that cured me of being an evangelical fundamentalist was working for an abusive evangelical minister of some reputation, who was, it turns out, basically a carnival huckster in his practices. And I'm not going to go too much into that. But there is that sense among the leaders of groups like this that you have to lie to tell the truth, which is something I'll go into again next week when I talk about the psychic fakery controversy. But spoilers. Another film where we think about the way in which people behave when they have been converted, and we think about the odd things they do is a genuinely great movie. It's a horror movie called The Invitation. You have Logan Marshall Green, who is, you can see him on the left looking doubtful, who is cinema's most proficient Tom Hardy lookalike. Plays a man who has been invited to a dinner party along with all his old friends who he hasn't seen for a long time, hosted by his ex-wife and her new guy, who's called David. He's played by Michael Huysmans, who's, I think, was on Game of Thrones. I'm not a Game of Thrones fan, but I know him from being a regular in Orphan Black years ago. It becomes apparent that they've actually found something and they've joined a new religion, and they are hosting this dinner party with an ulterior motive. I'm going to show you a brief clip from the bit where the ulterior motive comes up. Oh, or maybe not. Hang on. Right.
They're in
There
a
we are.
cult.
No, stop. We're not in a cult.
I know plenty of people who do the invitation.
You did?
Yeah. Eden, you guys really in this?
We are. So that's why you were in Mexico.
Did you get all naked down there in the jungle?
Sometimes. Well, I did.
You did. But it's just a group of people coming together. They all have lost someone, and they help each other.
It's really a science rather than like some weird religious cult or anything. It's smart people like us.
Here in LA, New York, thousands of people. You'd be surprised.
Yeah, my boss is into it. It's like a new Est or something, right?
Yeah, I think it's a little more grounded than that, more practical. And at the same time, it's very spiritual, however you define that.
Seriously, what goes on down there? I mean, is it like a self-help group thing, or?
Well, since you asked, we have something that we'd like to show you.
David.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes.
No.
Perfect.
Oh, no. Now I understand why the doors are locked. You're going to convert us. This is a conversion thing, right?
Oh my God. No, this is the real reason.
I know it sounds a little weird, but it's pretty amazing stuff.
Indulge us, okay?
Is this some kind of a recruitment video? I really don't want
I do. Convert me. I'm weak.
Yeah, you are. It's nothing like that. I promise.
All right, let's do this.
This is our home in Sonora, Mexico, and it is your home too, if you choose it to be.
It is your home too, if you choose it to be. I've been at that dinner party. Well, I mean, I've not been at a dinner party where the hosts actually try to implicate you in a ritual mass murder, but I have been at the dinner party where people are invited along, and there's a couple of people who shouldn't be there. I don't know if you're watching that, and if you haven't seen this movie before, if you spotted that there's at least one person in that dinner party gathering who really, really doesn't fit the rest of the dinner party gathering. It's like, oh, so we've got a dinner party and we've got all of our student friends, and oh, here's the youth leader from the local Baptist congregation as well, who's just here as well. And you realize that they're actually not there to have a dinner party with friends. They're there to have a conversation about Jesus or about whatever it is they're wanting. And it's horrible. It's horrible and it's dishonest. And there's that sense, particularly for new converts, and you haven't seen them since they sort of like had their religious experience, that you feel, what's happened to my friends? And why have they broken the social contract? Because, you on the other hand, because they're the hosts, you're kind of there sort of keeping the social contract and trying not to be brutally embarrassed by the horror of this. But there's this mounting uncomfortable, awful feeling that something is happening here and something has happened to these people, and they're all like, you know, this has changed my life, please watch this video, please take this leaflet, which I think is again a testament to the fact that the people who have undergone religious conversions don't always understand how religious conversions work. This worked for me. Why isn't it working for you? And the answer is, of course, because it worked for me. But so on. Another film, and this is a film. Oh, hang on. PowerPoint. Another film that looks at conversion and brainwashing and stuff, and again talks about dependency, is Sean Durkin's film Marcy May, Marlene. Elizabeth Olsen plays Martha. She goes to what seems to be a lovely commune. This happens in Doomsday as well. Someone goes to a lovely commune and winds up being inducted into the cult. She goes to this commune. It's run by Patrick, who's played by John Hawkes at his most scary. And she is entranced by it to the extent that she is first told she has the potential to be a teacher and a leader, which is a phrase she parrots over and over again over the course of the film, even after she escapes from the commune. But that opens up the fact that she is also abused and raped as well by the cult leader, who essentially uses the women as his private harem. And even after a terrible thing happens and she is driven to run away, she finds it very difficult to process what has happened to her and finds it almost impossible to recover. There is a trauma there in what has happened to her. And the trauma isn't just the abuse that she's gone through or the terrible atrocity that she witnesses. It is actually tied up into that much more subtle, cumulative abuse of having had her identity stripped away. The title itself refers to the fact that in the commune she's called Marcy May because she's renamed by the cult leader, which is something that Charles Manson used to do to his acolytes. And there is a sort of a Manson thing going on in this film. And also that the women call themselves Marlene. They're all called Marlene when they're talking to outsiders. In the TV series The Path, which appeared on Hulu in the US and on Amazon in the UK, you have a cult that's like Scientology. They recruit by turning up at one point with disaster relief and then taking the homeless refugees from the tornado-struck town back to their compound and indoctrinating them and many of these people join because they've got nowhere else to go and these people are so kind. You have power struggles going on, and the show is essentially about how a cult segues into becoming a lasting religion over the course of its first generation dying off and its second generation taking over. You see evangelism efforts. You see here we've got a couple of the supporting characters from the show, and they're wearing the T-shirts. I have one of those T-shirts. It's one of my favorite things. And they're talking to some poor woman who's sitting on a park bench just minding her own business, reading a book, and trying to tell her the good news about their religion. Again, you have the leadership, and here typified particularly by Cal, who's played by Hugh Dancy, as people who have a privileged relationship with the truth, with a sense that you have to lie to tell the truth, that there are things that the rank and file members of the cult, that the congregation do not know, that everyone else does know. And once again, you have that sense of separation. Even though people may not be happy, they hide the fact that they're individually unhappy from each other, and therefore police each other and force each other to conform behaviorally with the ways in the cult. And that really is the central plank of what I'm trying to say. The idea that brainwashing in a cult is really a set of social controls and generally depends upon you having a community. It is a very, very rare person who holds beliefs like this, who manages to keep them when confronted with the beliefs of other people in a realistic and non-confrontational way. One of the things about the path as well, and I mean, one of the things about the path that I love is that it's about Scientology, really, although they constantly say the one line that's repeated more often than any other in the show is, "We're not the Scientologists," which I think they repeatedly say in order that the Scientologists don't sue them, because the Scientologists will sue you. But they have electrometers. They have these little electrical meters that they attach with electrodes in order to sort of figure out what's wrong with their bodies and things like that. And okay, so here's my dad's copy of Dianetics, because my dad collected this stuff. And this is a 1973 printing of L. Ron Hubbard's Scientology Bible. Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health, the Handbook of Dianetic Procedure. Inside the front cover, there is this sort of little screed there, which as you go down, you realize is in fact a disclaimer. For this reason, the church does not wish to accept individuals who desire treatment of physical illness or insanity, but refers to these to qualified specialists of other organizations who deal in these matters. That's a lie, by the way. Scientologists believe that psychiatry is evil. The Hubbard electrometer is a religious artifact used in the church confessional. It in itself does nothing, and is used by ministers only to assist parishioners in locating areas of spiritual distress or travail. It does nothing. They're basically saying that their tools don't do anything, and they're not responsible for your mental health. This is essentially saying, if this screws you up, you cannot sue us, which I think is Scientology all over. But it's also a sign of what psychiatrists and psychologists have since the year 1956 called cognitive dissonance. That is the ability to reconcile contradictory ideas, which is central to pretty much, well, it's central to life, really, if you think about it, but particularly to religion and the most extreme religion. And cognitive dissonance as a term was coined by Professor Leon Festinger, who, in a book called When Prophecy Fails, which is a really interesting book, because what happened was that Festinger, 2 of his colleagues and 4 of his grad students infiltrated a doomsday cult. They worked out that there was this cult that was waiting for doomsday and had set a date. It's the 21st of December 1953, I think, was the date. And so they decided to infiltrate the cult and pretend to be cult members and do as much as they could not to affect the cult, and observe the appendix in the back where he actually goes into the story of how that worked, whether that worked, is fascinating, because essentially he makes the point that that was impossible, because the moment you have, for one, 7 people joining the cult all in one go, where everyone's like, an influx, we must be right, we shall proselytize more. And then they'd go to meetings and they try desperately to say neutral, non-committal things. But these things would then be interpreted by the cult leaders and developed and would alter the doctrine of the cult, which was in a constant state of flux. So it was kind of really, really interesting that he's sort of in this doomsday cult and then trying to just literally there just to see what happens when doomsday didn't come. But they're in the process of changing that by the very act of being there. Because suddenly you've got a group of 7 people, all of whom pretend not to know each other, who are all presenting a unified front. Of course it's going to change the cult. It's an interesting thing. It's also, I think I was reading this book and I was just thinking, this needs to be made into a movie. And then I remembered that it had, in fact, been the source of a movie. So in Brit Marling's 2012 film, Sound of My Voice, Brit Marling plays a cult leader who claims to be from the future and who has a little isolationist group, and they all wear white, and they're all training each other with guns, and they're expecting doomsday to happen. And there's a couple who have joined the cult, not because they believe, but because they want to be there when doomsday doesn't happen, in order to sort of keep some sort of view of it. But what happens is that by being there, they alter how things go. And the cult, again, is built to create dependence. It's built to make people conform. The film is fantastic. I think it's hugely underrated, and I think one of the reasons it's hugely underrated is because it's hugely misunderstood. I think it's a film that really does reward close attention, because there are a lot of things that happen in the film which on the surface can be interpreted one way, but if you actually think about them deeply, have a much more obvious explanation. And that's hugely important, because on the one hand, basically the film plays the trick of trying to create in you some kind of conversion experience under false pretenses. So the main character, one of the main characters, decides that it's all a lie. One of them, by the end of the film, she's got him. She's completely got him. He is absolutely lost, totally sold. It's too late, but it doesn't matter, because he's going to carry that mystery for the rest of his life. At the end of the film, you sort of feel that. But it's the outworking of that that's fascinating. Now, there's another scene in the film which is also particularly interesting, where someone asks her to sing a song from the future, if she's from 20 years in the future, from a time machine. And she sings this song, and a guy sticks his hand up and says, well, that's a song by the Cranberries, and that's from about 1993. And she boots him out of the cult, and then turns to the guy's wife and says, it's you or us, it's him or us. Do you want to go with him or stay with her? And she chooses the cult over her husband, who is kicked out. And that's an example of a phenomenon that we're going to look at a little bit more closely now. So in the 1995 film Safe, you have Carol, who's played by Julianne Moore. It's set in about 1984. She is a wealthy, spoiled, and immensely shallow Los Angeles housewife. She's not a bad person, she's just thick, who thick as in stupid, not thick as in the way people use it now, sorry. Yeah, she's just not very bright. Like the earliest scene in the film where she appears, she's having an existential crisis because the furniture people have delivered a black sofa, not a teal one, and that's the worst thing that could ever happen to her. Until she starts becoming allergic to everyday life, and she starts having allergic reactions to car exhausts and shampoo and the perm and the hairdressers and food, and everything suddenly becomes toxic to her, and she drastically looks around and eventually winds up leaving her family, her husband and kid, and going to a cult compound. And I'm going to show a scene from that self-help cult compound sequence.
Marilyn?
I was deeply wounded as a child and had completely blocked it out for years, and then suddenly became very ill.
Why do you think?
Maybe to let myself know something was wrong.
Okay. And the person who hurt you the most
It was me.
for?
Not forgiving him.
Okay. Thank you, Marilyn. Carol, would you like to respond? Okay. Okay. We don't want to force anyone. Nell,
What?
would you like to take part?
What is the question?
The question is, why did you become sick?
First I got sick, and my husband thought I was crazy. And then he got sick the same way.
What was happening in your life around the time that you how were you feeling when you first got sick?
I just wanted to get a gun and blow off the heads of everyone who got me like this.
Now, nobody out there made you sick, you know that. The only person who can make you get sick is you, right? Whatever the sickness, if our immune system is damaged, it's because we have allowed it to be, through exactly the kind of anger that you're showing us now. Does that make sense? Does anybody have a problem with that? Which is why you need to remember your affirmations and figure out how to love Nell a lot more. And even Nell's disease. And put that gun of yours away.
So, while that's all very calm and everything, obviously there's some shocking abuse happening there. First, he tells a woman that the reason that she's suffering from toxic shock syndrome is because she has not forgiven her abuser. And then when this woman says, you know, she really wants to do something about the people who made her, who poisoned her, he's like, the only person who can make you sick is you. That's obviously bullshit, but it's the central plank of what's happening. But he also, you know, he hammers her down and then tells everyone that they need to love her, which is, again, a particular sort of group abuse. That's an example of part of what we call love bombing. Now, love bombing is a term that in the last couple of years has been used far too much on the internet about things that aren't actually love bombing. But love bombing is, in religious terms, the idea that when someone joins, you shower them with affirmation and support and all these things, and practical support, emotional support, friendship and stuff. But the moment they go off message, they get smacked right down. All the support is withdrawn at a stroke. And it's an unbelievably effective way of keeping people in control. And the term was first coined by the man who has done more sustained and intentional work on the mechanics of brainwashing in writing than any other thinker. I am talking about Reverend Sun Myung Moon, the founder of the Unification Church, better known as the Moonies. This fucker is completely shameless. He basically came up with ideas of how to brainwash people. So he describes love bombing in specific terms. He calls it love bombing and says, this is how you keep people in control and stop them going off message. He was also involved in things like international arms dealing and all sorts of terrible racist stuff. He was in cahoots with the right-wing dictators that South Korea had for many years. He was also a fundraiser for the Republicans in the 1970s. Although they did, to be fair to them, you know, because you've got to be fair to them somehow, is keep it up. They kept him at arm's distance. There's a big industry of atrocity literature about how terrible the Moonies were. One of the most significant books of the late 70s is the book Moonwebs, Journey into the Mind of a Cult by Josh Freed. And he's a Canadian journalist, and his friend Benji got recruited into the Moonies, and they kidnapped him and dragged him home and set a cult deprogrammer on him to bring Benji back and remove him from the cult. Freed's book is partly the story of how Benji got recruited, the processes by which he became fanatical very quickly, and how they kidnapped him and how they deprogrammed him. And the other half of it is the story of the Moonies and about what Reverend Moon got up to and his various business things, like the fact that he was in international arms dealing and things like that. And it's, you know, it's a pretty solid piece of cult atrocity literature, but has the added advantage of the detail of someone who'd actually been through it, albeit through that kind of lens of having been deprogrammed and turned against it. It was popular enough that 2 movies were made based upon this book in the space of a year. Ticket to Heaven in 1981 and Split Image in 1982, and both of them more or less have an identical plot. You have a young man who is recruited by lovely, friendly people, one of whom is an attractive young woman. So there's kind of like the sort of lure of romance. He gets asked to go on a retreat camp and experiences the quick fire method that Sun Myung Moon presented for brainwashing people very quickly. So what Moon realized was that it is possible to make a religious conversion happen really quickly by using CIA methods, by basically torturing people without them realizing that they're being tortured. So they go on what is essentially this ghastly religious holiday camp where they're not allowed to sleep, and they have like a new activity every 3 minutes, and they've got to do exercise and sports and stupid party games and go to seminars and all those things, and the food is really inadequate, so they're malnourished and they're hungry and they're tired and they're lost, and they reach a point where essentially they're pushed into a state of absolute utter aporia. They've got nothing left, no resources left, and bam, dark night of the soul, and then they're hammered with the message over and over again and forced to participate. And by the end of 3 days of it, you're prepared to give Reverend Moon your soul for a packet of crisps or potato chips if you are in the USA. And this is how you do quick industrial level brainwashing, and it's torture, it's abuse, it's horrible. And the films, although Ticket to Heaven is the official one, although it takes great pains not to mention the Moonies by name, presumably because at the time Reverend Moon's church was quite powerful and prone to sue anybody who mentioned them. Split Image has a cult leader in his place who's played by Peter Fonda, and to be honest, if you want a film with a cult leader in, I can't think of a better one than Peter Fonda. I mean, he's just fantastic as an old hippie, right? As a sinister old hippie, he's amazing. So they're good. But you know, the same plot happens in Ticket to Heaven. It's Kim Cattrall. In Split Image, it's Karen Allen, who is best known for being Marion in Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark, even, and Indiana Jones of the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull as well. I think she's in, isn't she? But yeah, at the end of the film, both protagonists get kidnapped by their families, and a cult deprogrammer comes and deprograms them out of it. And in Ticket to Heaven, he's basically a sort of heroic fall guy kind of guy who sort of comes in the manner of an 80s TV hero and like goes off into the sunset to rescue someone else. And in Split Image, he's played by a much more complex character. He's a much more complex character portrayed by James Woods, who is presented as unpleasant and seedy and miserable and a little bit unethical. And Split Image also has a sense that there are consequences to deprogramming. Now let's talk about the consequences of deprogramming. Another deprogramming film, and we're getting towards the end of the talk now. I'm running a bit over. Another deprogramming film is Holy Smoke from 1999, which is a Kate Winslet vehicle. It's the film she made after Titanic. She plays an Australian student who goes to India and finds a guru, joins a cult, doesn't want to come home. She's lured back home by a made-up story about her dad dying of cancer and given into the frankly pervy clutches of Harvey Keitel, the cult exeter, who has more than he bargains for and winds up getting, he's the one who winds up getting deprogrammed of his patriarchal urges and bowing down to the goddess Winslet. It's a bad film. It's a Miramax film, so it's made by Harvey Weinstein. So you know, I never advocate piracy, and I've bought a copy, but you know, if you can find a way to watch it without giving Harvey Weinstein money that is good for your conscience, please feel free. But it just doesn't present, it tries to get across an interesting thing. It tries to get across the very true thing that actually, if you think about it, all social interaction basically amounts to brainwashing, in that socially we are constantly policing and changing each other's behavior. So the film doesn't get further than maybe you've been brainwashed. But it does get across how awful the deprogramming is not as awful as it could be. In fact, the best film about a deprogrammer that I have seen is the 2014 oddity, Faults, made by Riley Stearns. It stars Mary Elizabeth Winstead as a young woman who is again kidnapped and put into the hands of a cult deprogrammer called Ansel Roth. He's played by Leland Orser, who I think is best known for being in ER for many years. Ansel Roth is someone who has a reputation for having been a cult deprogrammer, having been on telly, having been like a guru for it, and he wrote a couple of books. It's all gone wrong for him. It's gone wrong because one of his former subjects was subjected to terrible abuses of conscience on television, and was told on live TV that the cult that she had been kidnapped from and deprogrammed of had committed mass suicide, and she had escaped that. So immediately afterwards, she went and did the same. There's a bit towards the beginning of the film where he's giving a seminar and her brother appears and says to him, "You gang raped her mind." And this, I think, is the central problem with deprogramming as a thing, because essentially it adopts Moon's methods to not de-brainwash someone, but to counter-brainwash someone. They're, again, deprived of sleep and food, they're constantly battered, they're separated from the group that they were part of, and there is a reason that deprogramming actually doesn't work a whole lot, because it doesn't. It works maybe half the time at most. And one of the reasons it doesn't work a whole lot is that you can't fix a trauma by a trauma. And it doesn't work fully anyway, in that you always wind up a little bit broken by it, as you might be. You wind up with post-traumatic stress disorder, possibly. You wind up with all sorts of problems because it doesn't fix you. And also, conversion experiences are pretty permanent. So, to bring it to an end, let's look at what brainwashing is. Let's bring it all together. Brainwashing is inexact and difficult. It is inexact and difficult. You can't always predict how it's going to work. And sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes it stops. However, it's inexact and difficult unless it's achieved with actual torture. Then you have a success rate that rockets. Moon wasn't wrong. You can brainwash people by depriving them, basically by making sure that they're continually told they're among friends and then deprived of sleep and food and the ability to argue for long enough. People break. Not everybody, not all the time, but people break. It's not 100%. But people break. So brainwashing is born of trauma. And even if you have your religious experience, and not all religious experiences are brainwashing. People see the light in 100 different ways. They see the light in as many ways as there are people. But these experiences are born of trauma. The trauma of having your heart ripped out is the beginning that makes you vulnerable to these things. You may get away with it without it. You may escape. You may get yourself out of it. I know I did. But it is born of trauma. It is consolidated by social pressures. Brainwashing happens when people are in groups. If you separate from the groups, it's very difficult to maintain extreme views if you're the only person and you start making friends who don't actually believe in what you believe. And I mean, when I was with the evangelical fundamentalists, I was told not to trust my family. I was told that friends who were not Christian friends were there because they were there to be evangelized. And I was told that you should absolutely, totally never have a romantic partner. And of course, they only meant straight romantic partners. So you should never have a romantic partner who wasn't a member of the faith. And all of these were ways to stop you being exposed to other ways of thinking. Brainwashing is only normally effective on some people some of the time. Consider Marshall Applewhite, the founder of Heaven's Gate, had hundreds of followers, but only 30 joined the away team, cut their balls off, and committed suicide. It's only normally effective on some people some of the time. You've got to think not about all the people who do this stuff. When you hear cult atrocity stories, you have to think about all the people who don't. It's only normally effective on some people some of the time, but it has a permanent effect. It will never really be effaced. And even if you become someone who believes the opposite of what you believed, you will always have that mark on you. And this is simply more complicated than hypnosis. It's more complicated than creating fanatics in a factory, although Reverend Moon tried and indeed succeeded with it. It's about a profound form of social control that extends beyond religion, which by no way has the monopoly on it.